12,000 Nazi bunkers, 400 miles of tank traps and hidden underground fortresses.
It was one of the most formidable defenses ever built in Europe.
Built to intimidate their enemies and protect the sacred soil of the fatherland.
Our forces must fight for every inch of ground.
Its sheer scale, the sheer nerve and arrogance of thinking up such a project is quite breathtaking.
The Allies' campaign to crack these defences raged for 6 months.
This place is armed to the teeth.
And resulted in some of the biggest and bloodiest battles of World War II.
The enemy must be destroyed.
This is Hitler's Siegfried Line. The biggest construction projects of World War II, ordered by Hitler to secure world domination. Now they survive as dark reminders of the Führer's fanatical military ambition. These are the secrets of the Nazi megastructures. November 1944, 5 months after D-Day. Germans are battling to stop the Allied advance across Europe. But they're in retreat and now face an Allied assault on Germany itself. 21-year-old German Army Private Fritz Tillmans is on the front line, fighting to defend the fatherland. His life and the future of Nazi Germany now depends on one of Hitler's most ambitious megastructures. Called the Siegfried Line by the Allies, this network of deadly defenses is known to the Germans as the West Wall. If the line is breached, the Allies are one step closer to Berlin and winning the war. Former Lieutenant and Infantry Commander Patrick Berry is exploring what remains of the fortifications.
The Siegfried Line defences are some of the most complex defences ever built. They're designed in belts and to create defence in depth, and they consist of concrete bunkers, log-line trenches, fortresses, hundreds of miles of barbed wire, and thousands of mines. It stretched all the way from the north of Germany's western border down to the south, and it was part of Hitler's plan to make the western part of Germany impregnable.
The story of the Siegfried Line starts in 1936, when Hitler makes a decisive move towards world domination. In total defiance of World War I's Versailles peace settlement, he stations troops in the Rhineland. The Allies had banned the German military from this industrial border zone to prevent further European conflict. Hitler's master plan hinges on remilitarizing the Rhineland and the construction of massive defenses.
Hitler's very keen to defend his western frontier because he has big plans, and those plans involve German expansion. But he sees that expansion taking place to the east. What he feels is that it's Germany's manifest destiny to take territory, and he's going to do that in places like Poland and the Ukraine. And so defending his western frontier allows him to do that to the east without worrying about attack from the Western powers.
Hitler starts construction on a series of fortifications that will eventually stretch 400 miles across Germany's western border. It's an interlocking system of tank traps, anti-personnel devices, trenches, pillboxes, and subterranean command centers.
The Siegfried Line is what is known as a defense in depth. A defense in depth doesn't rely on a single line of fortification. It's not a single line of trenches. Rather, it is a series of interlocking defensive zones. As an enemy advances into a defense in depth, the way that the defensive zones and obstacles are structured forces to take certain paths into pre-planned killing grounds.
As the attackers are drawn deeper into the maze of defenses, they're stripped of their supporting armor and artillery. Exposed and isolated, they can be easily eliminated. Hitler makes the Siegfried Line a national priority, and in May 1938 brings in engineer Dr. Fritz Todt to oversee the works. Modest and unassuming, Todt is not your typical Nazi. But as the creator of the world-famous Autobahn road system, he's proved that he can think big, which is just what Hitler wants for the defense of the Third Reich.
Mein Führer, the fortifications will be complete before the start of winter, including the extra armor and concrete structures you ordered. 287,000 workers are now assigned to this project from our organization alone.
Excellent.
Hitler wants the fortifications ready in just 4 months, to coincide with plans to invade Czechoslovakia in October 1938. Todt is authorized to call upon all the resources that Germany has to offer.
Todt throws everything at the project. I mean, all other major construction projects which are underway in the Reich are cancelled, they're put on hold. Vast amount of manpower, virtually every single civil engineer in the country is diverted to us to feed this one big project of the Siegfried Line.
With Todt in charge, construction moves forward at a rapid rate.
The Siegfried Line development is a hugely ambitious project. I mean, the amount of concrete involved, the amount of manpower involved, the cost involved is truly phenomenal. Nothing like this has ever been built in Germany before.
Battlefield archaeologist Dr. Tony Pollard is near the German border with Belgium. He's searching for evidence of how Fritz Todt engineered Hitler's Siegfried Line.
This looks like a hedge line, the edge of any field, beautiful rolling agricultural landscape. But when you get into it, what you find are these huge concrete chunks. They're known as dragon's teeth, and these are anti-tank defences, and they're one of the characteristic components of the Siegfried Line.
Tanks roll forward and become trapped on the dragon's teeth. The hull of the vehicle is exposed and can then be targeted with explosives.
Here's a broken tooth that gives us a great idea of how these things were constructed. They would take wooden moulds, put in the iron reinforcing rods, and then pour in the concrete. This is just one tooth, but there are thousands of them. A massive undertaking. You're looking at 193 tons of this iron per kilometre of dragon's teeth. 5,500 cubic metres of concrete for every kilometre.
But dragon's teeth are just the beginning. Hitler also orders the construction of another 10,000 bunkers.
The Siegfried Line is hugely ambitious. Its sheer scale, the sheer nerve and arrogance almost of thinking up such a project is quite breathtaking.
The Siegfried Line bunkers range in size and style. There are simple concrete shelters, machine gun emplacements, and then the enormous and highly sophisticated underground forts, known as Biwak bunkers.
The Siegfried Line is made up of a huge number of installations, and among the most impressive of those are the subterranean Biwak bunkers. And this is one of them, the Cat's Head.
Though unassuming at ground level, The Katzenkopf bunker is one of the largest and most complex fortifications ever built by Nazi engineers. It's one of 32 command and control centers, placed at key tactical points along the German border. Four stories deep, this sprawling underground lair contains everything an 80-man troop needs to be self-sufficient for up to 30 days.
There would have been a steel turret here, 30 centimeters thick, and mounted inside it were a pair of twinned machine guns. And this thing would have been capable of turning 360 degrees, and if you looked out, you'd have an amazing view of the valley, so this could spray machine gun fire across the entire landscape. But this isn't the only armament that this bunker had. In another, there's a flamethrower, or a Flammenwerfer, as the Germans describe it, and that could fire flames for over 80 meters, again around a 360-degree circle. This place is armed to the teeth.
But not everything in this bunker is high-tech.
Whoa, I know what this is. There would have been a trapdoor over here that most of the time would have been closed, but if the place was under attack, the trapdoor would have been lifted. And if the enemy broke through the door, they'd fall straight into this.
Hitler watches closely as the Siegfried Line takes shape. He carefully stage manages his frequent visits to the site and projects an image of Nazi Germany as an impenetrable fortress.
The Siegfried Line is a very important propaganda tool for Hitler. It demonstrates Germany's ability to muster manpower, resources, and also represents its military strength. And it's a warning shot to the West. On visiting the site once, he said, "I am the greatest builder of defences of all time."
March 1939, Hitler annexes Czechoslovakia. Desperate to avoid another war and intimidated by Germany's new defences, Britain and France have agreed not to intervene. And the Siegfried Line is about to prove even more critical to Hitler's master plan. Germany's western border finally secure behind thousands of bunkers and gun emplacements, Hitler sets his sights east, on Poland.
By the beginning of September 1939, the Siegfried Line is, to all intents and purposes, completed. And that's a huge relief for Hitler because he's itching to get into Poland. He does invade on the 1st of September 1939.
Poland falls in just 4 weeks. The Siegfried Line now becomes the front line for Hitler's expansion west.
Once Poland's under Nazi control, he then turns his attention west, and on the 10th of May 1940, he invades Belgium, Holland and France. France is one of the biggest military countries in the entire world, and all three countries are completely overrun within 6 weeks.
By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany has more than doubled in size. In the west, the Third Reich reaches the Atlantic Ocean.
With all these victories, the Western Front is no longer on the borders of Germany, but actually on the Atlantic coast. What that means is for the Siegfried Line is suddenly it's no longer needed.
Then in December 1941, everything changes when Hitler declares war on America. His western border along the French coast is now at risk of Allied invasion. He orders the Siegfried Line to be dismantled and used to strengthen the Atlantic Wall.
And they take away the doors. They take away the ventilation systems. And look at this. This huge steel blast door has just been ripped out and recycled. The gun mounts, anything that's of use. And it's all shipped over to the Atlantic Wall to bolster its defences. But the problem is that weakens the Siegfried Line.
The German army abandoned the bunkers, dragon's teeth and trenches of the Siegfried Line. The once formidable structures fall into disrepair. With the war now playing out on a global scale, hundreds of thousands of young men are conscripted into the German army. Among them, Fritz Tillmans, who recalls the war in his memoirs.
On the 13th of April 1942, I was drafted into the Wehrmacht.
Fritz Tillmans. Jawohl, Herr Offizier.
After just 12 weeks of training, I was sent to the Eastern Front to build defensive positions and fight the Russians.
Sehr gut. Danke. Danke.
I didn't realize at the time, but these experiences would stand me in good stead to serve on the Siegfried Line.
While the war rages, the Siegfried Line is virtually forgotten about. Until D-Day. On the 6th of June 1944, 160,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches at Normandy and overrun the Atlantic Wall. Hitler has made a terrible mistake.
It's all very well taking all this stuff from the Siegfried Line as long as you don't ever need it again. The problem is that the Allies overrun the Atlantic Wall, the Germans are in full retreat from Normandy, and suddenly they're heading back to the Siegfried Line, which is nothing more than a concrete shell. And it's made worse by the fact that so many of the things they need are just simply gone forever.
The Western Front must be strengthened at once. I want an immediate report on the organization of labor and the progress of construction. Our forces must defend every inch of ground from our enemy. That is an order.
The Nazis race to reinforce the Siegfried Line. Hitler also brings in his best defensive tactician, Field Marshal Walther Model.
He is a ruthless and actually not particularly well-loved commander by the officers. The men like him. They nickname him the front pig because he spends a lot of time visiting the soldiers on the front, and he's very careful to make sure that he's taking risks that his soldiers take. On a number of occasions, he actually personally leads defenses with pistols in his hand. Because of this sort of aggression and his lack of finesse, Hitler particularly likes him.
On the 15th of August 1944, Hitler summons Model to the Wolf's Lair.
Ah, my favorite general.
Heil Hitler.
I have something for you. You are my lion of defense. For your accomplishments in restoring the front in central Poland.
After decorating Model, Hitler reveals his plan.
I have a new assignment for you.
Jawohl, mein Führer.
You are to take over the command of Army Group West with immediate effect. The defense of the fatherland's western border is in your hands. Herr General.
Under Model's command, the Nazi war effort in the West is now focused on the Siegfried Line. After storming the beaches at Normandy, the British and other allies push north along the coast to liberate Belgium and Holland, while the Americans head straight for the Siegfried Line to strike at the heart of Germany. Model waits for the Americans at the point most prone to attack.
Everything in order, men?
A zone called the Aachen Gap.
Yeah.
The Aachen Gap is a narrow corridor between the city of Aachen and the densely wooded Hürtgen forest. A historic invasion route, it's the most direct way into Germany's industrial heartland. Rich in coal, steel and iron resources, the Ruhr Valley is a vital tactical position.
They really need to keep Germany intact, especially the industrial regions of the Ruhr Valley. If the Americans take those, the war is effectively lost. So Model is put in effectively to save Germany.
Model is pleased with what he finds.
Exactly! The position is fantastic!
The combination of bunkers and dense forest around Aachen will cause major problems for the Americans. The remains of these fortifications can still be found in the forests of Western Germany today.
In the Hürtgen forest, Hitler has engineered a nightmare for the Allies. This bombed-out bunker mightn't look like much now, but 70 years ago it was a pretty formidable position for the Allies to have to take, and it cost them a lot of casualties in doing so. It was bunkers and pillboxes like this that formed the heart of the Siegfried Line. This one would have been complemented by another one, perhaps 200 yards up there, and another one 200 yards over there, all interlocking with each other so they could support each other as best as possible.
This is one of almost 3,500 Type 10 bunkers that Model strengthens in preparation.
So here we've got a gunning portal where they could have put any kind of machine gun or maybe perhaps a larger caliber weapon here to fire out on the attackers. You've got the air intake duct here. We know they're very keen to keep the building gas tight because they're very afraid of gas attack. And then we move in where you would have had a heavy, thick door, perhaps up to between 20 and 50 mil thick, which would have closed tightly against this to keep the structure airtight.
Model's troops dig in, waiting for the American attack. Among them is Private Fritz Tillmans. He's already battle-weary from serving on the Eastern Front.
In 1944, they were desperate for experienced soldiers to fight on the Western Front. I'd fought in Russia, but been injured by shrapnel and admitted to hospital. As soon as possible, I was discharged and sent straight to the Hürtgen forest.
"5 years after being built, Hitler's mighty Siegfried Line will finally be tested in battle. On the 2nd of October 1944, American troops launched their attack north of the historic city of Aachen. After annihilating the Germans at Normandy, the Americans believe they're fighting a broken, second-rate army.
By this point of the war in Europe, the Allies had numerical advantage over the German. They had air superiority, they had more men on the ground, and importantly, they outnumbered German tanks by about 10 to 1. What the Germans had was the Siegfried Line.
It quickly becomes clear that Aachen is a focus of Nazi resistance. Bypassing it is not an option. The Americans will have to take the city. Their strategy is a two-pronged assault on the Siegfried Line from the north and south. Once they've encircled the city, they can pulverize it with bombs and shells. If they succeed, Aachen will be the first major German city to fall. But the Nazis have taken extra care to protect this strategic city. There are more dragon's teeth, reinforced bunkers, and bigger anti-tank obstacles.
Grief. This is an anti-tank wall, part of the defences of the Siegfried Line, and much grander than the dragon's teeth. Wow. I can see, stepping back, that it's at the base of a hill, and what it does, as part of the original design of the Siegfried Line, what it does at really minimal expense, it makes this hill theoretically impregnable. What they've done is use the terrain intelligently. It's that combination of blocky defences in tactically important locations. So this is right at the foot of a hill, so it effectively stops any advance upslope. It's an incredibly impressive structure.
After 3 weeks of hard fighting, the Americans overwhelm the tank defences. They're close to encircling Aachen. Model must act fast to save the city.
We must stop them surrounding Aachen.
I've come from Aachen.
The Führer has commanded that we will not give up 1 inch of ground. His command is sacred. Fight to the last man. If necessary, be buried in the ruins. Send in the 116th Panzer and the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Divisions.
Yes, General Field Marshal.
Nicknamed the Fireman, Model is the man Hitler sends in to rescue the Third Reich from desperate situations. But even his tactical expertise is no match for the American firepower.
Model really just doesn't have enough armor to stave off this great American attack. The Americans have such an advantage in armor and firepower that Model's limited resources simply can't keep up.
On the 11th of October, the Americans unleash hell. In a single hour, artillery battalions fire 5,000 shells into the city, while Allied air forces drop over 62 tons of bombs. They finally blast their way into Aachen. For the first time in World War II, the Nazis are fighting for a major German city.
The Germans knew this town like the back of their hands, and they used it to their advantage. They used everything it had to offer as a form of defense. They were in the cellars. They turned them into bunkers. And the Americans passed, the Germans would pop out and attack them from the rear. The Americans were forced to attack them with grenades and flamethrowers. Imagine what the guys in there suffered during that fight. They were in the sewers. The Americans had to block up the manholes to stop them popping up. They took to the rooftops as snipers. They even dragged pieces of artillery up to the upper stories to rain fire down onto the Americans. They made them pay for every inch of this town.
It's a brutal battle, which takes a huge human toll. More than 10,000 American and German troops killed, wounded, or missing in action. 80% of the historic city of Aachen destroyed. American forces have punched through a small section of the Siegfried Line and captured their first major German city. But the fight for the Siegfried Line is far from over.
The Americans do ultimately capture Aachen after a protracted attack and a lot of very dirty urban fighting. But that's not the end of it for the Americans. They now have to go through the Hürtgen Forest. And the Hürtgen Forest is a very complex defense in which they have no advantage.
The Americans are about to stumble straight into Model's death trap. The Hürtgen Forest. On the 2nd of November 1944, American troops are in the forest flanking the city of Aachen. Model prepares his men. After losing Aachen, the situation looks desperate. But Model has built his reputation on winning against the odds.
Everyone must understand the gravity of the situation. This moment will be enough to distinguish the true men from the inept ones. Every soldier has the same responsibility. If one falls, Another must be ready to take his place.
Moving into the Hürtgen forest feeds into Modell's hands, because not only have you got the fixed defences of the bunkers and the mines and gun positions and all the rest of it, you've also got the natural defences of the forest.
The two great American strengths in firepower, tanks, and close air support aircraft are stripped away. They simply can't operate in the Hürtgen forest. The trees are too tightly packed, the ground is too close.
The Hürtgen forest's rugged terrain levels the playing field, giving the Germans a fighting chance against the superior military might of the Americans.
Get ready, lads. Hans, are you ready?
Yeah.
Fritz Tillmans recalls the start of the battle.
Our troops' mission was to defend the village of Schmidt, a key position on our supply route. We could see the Americans across the valley were trying to attack with tanks and infantry. There were so many of them, and we couldn't believe how they just kept coming.
Men like Fritz Tillmans and his units would have been dug in this area, holding firm. And here could well have been a fighting position. And if you get down here, you can see that basically this would be a decent enough position for a machine gun. You can see over the brow of the hill, it can support the other positions which would have been over there and down that way. And crucially, there would have been another big bunker position up in that hill. So it's all part of an interlocking defensive plan, trying to make it as tough as possible for the Allies to get into this area.
Conditions are cold and wet. The fighting is brutal. 2 US regiments are completely wiped out. GIs call this dense forest the Death Factory. Every 2 weeks, a new wave of American troops is thrown against the Siegfried Line. But they just can't break through.
It's 1, 2. These look like foxholes that were dug by the Americans here. We've got a few of them. It's just basically a simple, prepared position dug by infantry soldiers. That's all it is. You know, compared to the Germans who've got, you know, concrete defences on the Siegfried Line, all the poor bloody infantrymen here can do is dig in with their spades, you know, and their shovels, their small shovels.
Modell's tactics are working. But he's not content with just holding the Americans back. He wants to destroy them.
Ensure that Troop Wegelin is sent to the Hürtgen front immediately. I demand total dedication. The enemy must be destroyed.
Modell is considered to be a ruthless commander. Hitler says to one of his staff officers at one point, "By God, did you see that man? I trust him, but I wouldn't want to serve under him."
Determined to turn the war for Hitler, Modell orders his men to drive the Americans out of the Hürtgen and Germany. The 8th of November, 1944. German Army Private Fritz Tillmans has no choice but to leave the safety of the Siegfried Line and enter the fray.
We'd seen a huge number of GIs digging in the day before, and we only had a strength of about 30 to 40 men, many of whom were not experienced soldiers. I had serious doubts about our attack. It seemed like a suicide mission.
The problem now is the shoes on the other foot, and attacking is very different to defending.
Without the protection of the Siegfried Line, Tillman's unit becomes vulnerable.
We received orders to push our attack further along the east side of the valley. The first few hundred yards went fine, but then we came under artillery fire and we had our first casualties. Go, Hans! I'll cover you! Hans! Are you hit? Oh no! Pigs! One of my best friends was badly wounded. He died later at the first aid station.
The Germans quickly retreat back through the forest.
Things are getting pretty desperate. The conditions are horrendous here. We know that the quality of the troops is declining. They're losing a lot of senior NCOs, which are non-commissioned officers, basically leaders, so they're not as well led. And then supplies are running out too. They've got fewer and fewer ammunition. They don't have enough artillery shells to support them. And crucially, they don't have enough of their kind of personal fighting equipment, like sleeping systems and also rations.
Field Marshal Modell's counterattack may have failed, but the Siegfried Line is still holding firm.
Hürtgen Forest is one of the longest and bloodiest battles the US Army ever fights. And the truly horrific costs aren't really borne out on the ground. They haven't advanced that far. The Siegfried Line, where the positions are, and the forest defences are still largely intact, so they haven't fulfilled their objectives.
In just under 5 months, the Allies have liberated over 220,000 square miles of Western Europe. But now they've stalled at the Siegfried Line.
The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest ends in a kind of bitter, bloody stalemate in which casualties on both sides are absolutely enormous. About 30,000 men on both sides are killed.
Critically, the stalemate in the Hürtgen Forest has bought Hitler time. He's been secretly planning a major offensive just 20 miles further south and is moving troops into position, ready to launch them at the Allies.
The man he puts in touch with it is the man who's so tenaciously defended the Siegfried Line up to that point, Field Marshal Modell.
On the 16th of December, Hitler's miracle worker, Field Marshal Modell, puts the Führer's audacious plan into action. "250,000 German soldiers, 2,000 artillery pieces, and 1,000 tanks assault a 75-mile stretch of the American line. The plan is to surge forward through Belgium and drive the Allies back into the sea. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. The German counterattack across the Siegfried Line is Hitler's last roll of the dice.
Hitler, in all his irrationality, still thinks he can somehow scrape a victory or some advantage at the end of the war with an offensive. Catches the Americans by surprise and actually does gain some initial advantage and some initial advances. Really, it's never going to succeed.
The German forces can't sustain their ferocious momentum.
Outside of the defensive advantage offered by the Hürtgen Forest and the Siegfried Line, The Germans really don't have the capability to launch an attack. They don't have sufficient air power, they don't have sufficient artillery, and they're running out of fuel.
Once American reinforcements arrive, they quickly halt the Nazi advance. Hitler's desperate gamble to change the course of the war falters in just 3 weeks.
The great offensive that Hitler's planned, that Models carried out, has proved a busted flush, and they now have no choice but to retreat back away from the Siegfried Line, abandon it, and fall back behind the next great obstacle, which is the River Rhine.
The Allies coordinate a massive final push on all fronts. But with the German troops now in retreat, the Siegfried Line falls at a rapid rate.
Model no longer has the ability to counterattack, to stop those breaches. When he can't plug the holes, because he doesn't have the tanks, the material, the men to do it, then the line becomes pointless. It can't be defended. It's just a bunch of furniture out in the forest.
For all its technology and weaponry, the concrete fortress that is the Katzenkopf bunker is overrun in a day. And the reason is simple.
It's all well and good having a really impressive defensive system like the Siegfried Line, but you need the soldiers to man it. And by the time the Allies are knocking on Germany's front door, their military machine is pretty much broken, and Hitler just doesn't have the resources to throw at it. And they can't stave off the inevitable.
Although the Siegfried Line was a really strong defensive network, ultimately it was only as good as the men who occupied it. And when they lost their fighting spirit, it was easily overcome.
Just 6 weeks after the Americans break through the final Siegfried Line defenses, Hitler commits suicide, and the end of the war swiftly follows. As the Allies advance towards Berlin, they capture Private Fritz Tillmans. Field Marshal Model refuses to surrender to the British. On hearing he could face charges for war crimes, he shoots himself. Described by one Allied commander as the strongest net of fortifications ever constructed by the human race, the Siegfried Line cost the Americans 140,000 casualties. But ultimately, it was an overly ambitious project that the German forces simply couldn't maintain.
The truth is, with the Siegfried Line, and it applies to so many of the big Nazi projects, is that Germany is just resource poor. They don't have enough of anything. And so they start these huge, great projects, but they just don't have the manpower or the materials to really see it through. And this is certainly the case of the Siegfried Line. It's just too vast, it's too big an obstacle to effectively man.
Many of the structures along the Siegfried Line were so solidly built that the Allies found them impossible to demolish. They're testament to one of the biggest construction projects ever undertaken on German soil, and a reminder of the men who lost their lives fighting to defend and destroy it.